So Steve and I had a few minutes to catch up before at the back, and I said to Steve, you know, how intense is your day-to-day life? And I just want you to repeat the answer that you gave me on what your last 7 days has looked like.
Well, I wouldn't say it was typical, but definitely a long week. I started out and went from Boston to Phoenix, from Phoenix to London, London to Delhi, Delhi to Mumbai, Mumbai to Amsterdam, Amsterdam to Genoa, Genoa to Paris, and thank God I'm here now.
In Toronto. I think that deserves a round of applause for making it.
So I'm living the dream. I'm living the dream.
And you are definitely still operating every day if you're taking that level of three red eyes a week.
Absolutely.
So let's start a little bit at the beginning and what the genesis of Bain was, and how did you get into the PE business? And it looks like the exact right time in the market when it started.
Timing's everything. Timing's everything. But it's interesting. I really kind of an accidental PE person, because my grandfather was a shoemaker, came from Italy in 1924, and my father went to the war and got a degree in the GI Bill. Yeah. Only person to go to college in his family, so I didn't really know. I didn't know what PE was.
Right.
My mother was a school teacher, so I decided actually after graduating to probably become a teacher. But before then, my grandfather and grandmother and father said, the next depression is coming. This was in 1970. They always thought the depression was coming, so they said, if you go to Duke University and we pay for it, part of it, you need to major in accounting. Right. Because the only people employed during the depression were accountants, and maybe a secondary career as a lawyer.
Yeah.
So I chose accounting.
Yeah.
Which
the most interesting of the professions.
Well, with all respect to accountants, that wasn't my first choice. So I ended up, and it was even worse because I was off the turnip truck, and I didn't realize that to get a CPA, which they wanted me to get, you had to not only pass accounting exam and take 4 years of college, but you had to work for 3 years in accounting.
This is a big commitment.
Big commitment, much more than I thought. So when I went out of school, I interviewed all these accounting firms, and I went to each of them and said, because I thought, accounting's going to be reasonably boring. I said, can someone send me overseas? Whoever sends me overseas, I'll take a job with that firm.
Right.
And I was 22 years old. And 6 out of 7 said no, but one did. One sent me to Amsterdam.
Yeah.
And so I started there and really learned the basics of business. I think accounting, actually my grandfather was right, my father was right. It was a great thing to learn because you know the guts of every business when you study those companies.
Totally.
You know the P&L, you know the balance sheet. So it turned out accidentally to be a great preparation for private equity.
Yeah.
I then applied, coming from Holland, to a bunch of doctoral programs, and I got in the Harvard program, and I was going to be an economics professor. But when I got there, I needed to pay for it. Didn't have the money, so I got a summer job. And I looked down the list, and the highest paying jobs were investment banking and consulting.
Right.
And I didn't know what either one of those were, actually. So I had to study up on that for the interviews. And a small company called Bain & Company, which was a consulting firm started by Bill Bain in the late 70s, hired me for a summer job. And I figured I could pay for the rest of school with that money. And my eyes were really opened at Bain & Company. And they were kind of state-of-the-art at the time, and the growth share matrix had been invented at BCG, all the latest business techniques. And so I really had an exciting summer. And at the end of the summer, they wanted me to come and not get the doctorate, just get an MBA. And they gave me a bonus to come. And I said, okay, I'll go back to school in 2 or 3 years. I'll use this money I can pay for the whole education. Yeah. And now it's like 30 years later, I haven't been back.
Never wanted to go back to Harvard, just to give back.
And it's really funny. When they were recruiting me, they said, someday we think we could take consulting skills and apply that to direct investing. They honestly, Steve Schauber, who's passed away now, said that to me in my second interview. And I was very interested in that. I thought, okay, that's probably a selling pitch. That how can a consulting firm invest money? That'll never happen. Yeah. But it turns out it did happen.
And so then what was that transition from starting as a consultant to getting into the private equity business and figuring that out?
Well, my transition, I did a lot of learning from very smart people like David Bonderman and all the guys, legends of the PE business, because it turns out that one of my assignments was to help start up the Bain & Company private equity group. Yeah. It wasn't called private equity then, it was much more mundane. It was called leverage buyouts. You have to call it private equity now. But it was called leverage buyouts. Yeah. And so my boss started that, and he brought me over to do that. And so I was working for private equity companies. It was very embryonic then. I think there were probably 5 or 6 companies at that point in time. And so I learned a lot about buying businesses and doing the strategies and worked with those guys. So ended up, a bunch of them made me an offer. I told Bain I was going to leave and take an offer with a really great firm today. And Bain said, don't leave, we'll give you your own fund with Bain Capital. You can start a technology TMT type fund.
Yeah. And
I started that fund in 1989, and that did really well. And Bain Capital hadn't been doing that kind of investing. So that got merged in with Mitt Romney in 93, and I've been there ever since.
Very cool. Do you remember some of your first deals?
Yeah, absolutely. One of our keys to success is that, for better or for worse, we really invest alongside our limited partners.
Yeah.
So when Bain was funded, the funding came from a lot of the partners of Bain and Company, friends and family. In fact, the first fund was $36 million, and it took a couple of years to raise that fund because everybody said, I remember this, one of the first investors said, well, consultants can consult, but they can't do.
Right.
So it was daunting to raise that money, and they didn't buy the concept that you could take consulting skills and understand markets and make investments on that basis, because we weren't financiers. We weren't from New York.
Yeah.
The biggest thing we'd finance was a house mortgage at that point in time.
Right.
So we raised that money and put a lot of our own money into it. We didn't have much money, but everything we had, we put into it.
Yeah.
And we founded things like Staples and were very successful in that first fund.
Yeah.
And then it kind of took off, and we got other investors involved. But to this day, we're still the largest investors in our own funds. Every fund, private equity fund that we have, the partners in Bain Capital are the largest limited partners.
Right. It really aligns incentive.
Really aligns.
And it's like being an entrepreneur. When you go out at the beginning and all of your angel money comes from all the people that know you, and you're like, I'm not going to be able to go to like the family event if this doesn't go well, and you just feel the pressure of needing that first one to be a success.
Yeah, absolutely. Huge pressure, and it was our partners at Bain and Company. Were in the fund, and the first good-sized deal that I did was the Gartner Group was owned by Saatchi & Saatchi. The Gartner Group today, and then was a leading business doing publications, on technology.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So they're kind of the consumer reports for the entire technology industry. Mm-hmm. So Saatchi & Saatchi was having problems with the ad business, and so that business, the Gartner business, was losing $10 million a year, so they had to divest it. And we were fortunate enough, that was the first deal I did to win that auction.
Yeah.
And so it was a little scary because the company was losing $10 million a year. It was basically the first deal I did.
Right.
But I didn't know what I was doing, so I was very confident we could turn it around. And,
ignorance is bliss.
I actually borrowed money. My wife was going to kill me. I borrowed money, more than I was worth, to put the money into the company.
Yeah.
And talk about a long-term orientation. I just had a board call on the Gartner Group today. We bought the Gartner Group in 1991, and through the history of time, we bought it for $70 million and $6 million equity.
Yeah.
And today the company is worth $12.1 billion equity today, 30 years later. So it's been a huge success story. It's run by a classmate of mine from business school right now, and he's done a fabulous job for the last 6 or 7 years, really growing the company, doing more acquisitions, and they're the largest in research today.
So does your wife thank you for taking up that money and re-leveraging it and now making it 1,000 times over?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's been really good. It's been really good for Bain Capital and the investors of Bain Capital.
So now that Bain's grown, just for the benefit of everyone in the room, how do you think about differentiating yourself against everyone else in the space?
Well, it was really interesting. We started out differentiated, maybe not as a goal, but we were very differentiated because when we started Bain Capital out, all the firms that we competed with were really driven from Wall Street and big finance backgrounds, and also understanding businesses as well. We came at it from totally the side of business strategy.
Right.
So our pitch was we'd go to an entrepreneur. Tom Stenberg at Staples came to us and said, do you believe we can sell paper and supplies for all businesses in giant warehouses?
Yeah. And
many people turned them down, and we did a study, and we said, gee, in those days in the United States, there was a stationery store, there was an equipment store, and there was a desk store. So you had to go many places to start up a business.
Right.
And he had the idea to put it in a giant store. Mm-hmm. And I remember sitting around talking to the guys at the time, and we said, well, if the investment doesn't work out, it was pure startup, if the investment doesn't work out, people will always buy the paper, we get half our money back. And so at the time, it was a risk to say, will somebody walk into a place that big and buy all their equipment? Turns out now that became a multi-billion-dollar company, now being disintermediated by Amazon many, many years later, but it had a great run for about 20 years.
Yeah, yeah. And so when you think about that, I mean, that's an interesting way of thinking about your downside. I have a bunch of paper in inventory, and I don't think that will go down in value. But how do you think about protecting downside as you do these deals, besides just kind of the raw assets?
Well, we've learned a lot about that over the last 30 years, and what we look for is deals that we believe have asymmetric upside.
Right.
So not so much protecting the downside, but asymmetric upside. And part of that is looking for deals that we think there's a very low chance we lose our money in.
Mm-hmm.
And that came into play during the crisis. We had just invested a fund right before the crisis hit,
mm-hmm.
which was not a great time to be doing investments. The stock market dropped, as you know, dramatically. Advertising went down dramatically. But because we'd selected the right companies and we had the capability to go in and take out costs and weather the storm, and we structured the debt financings so that we could weather those storms,
right.
that portfolio ended up turning out to do 2 times people's money in
mm-hmm.
probably the worst time ever to raise a private equity fund.
Right.
But we learned a lot about the crisis. And we had gone from starting out being strategic consultants and had a competitive advantage doing that, and many in the industry started to do that as well. And in the last 15 years, we've really converted to having globally integrated vertical market groups. So
right.
we have a group that's expert in healthcare, a group that's expert in TMT, a group that's expert in retail consumer, a group that's expert in financial services, and a group that's expert in industrials. Mm-hmm. And we found in this kind of market, with the market at all-time highs, it's obviously, there's not like shooting fish in a barrel anymore. Mario talked about the valuations are so high.
Yeah.
We've got to have a really solid basis on how we're going to transform that company.
Mm-hmm.
And we call them kind of archetypes. But that's facilitated by having now a global organization of 1,000 people, having 65 people just dedicated to companies themselves, having this deep vertical expertise on a global basis.
Yeah.
So we can be selective with our opportunities and really look to transform those companies.
Yeah.
So in our last few deals we've done, probably the last 6 or 7 deals, they fit these archetypes of one of them. We bought 2 medical companies in the same industry mm-hmm. simultaneously and then put them together. So
right.
we had instant synergy.
Yeah.
We bought WorldPay out of the crisis. It's a financial services company. It needed a new system, needed to disengage from a bank. It's a credit card processing company. So we had a thesis. It was the largest one in London at the time, but not making a lot of money, and also it was a forced divestiture that had old systems and run by a bank. So our thesis was credit cards are going to be used more. We can build a new system. We can go pan-European. We can do acquisitions. We did all that, and it was a very successful investment for us. So I think having vertical market expertise,
yeah.
having a global reach,
mm-hmm.
and then looking for businesses only where we can kind of transform them and make them stronger strategically for the long term, that's what's worked for us.
Right, and it sounds like that. So what have been the surprises or failures along the way that were kind of the reset moments for you, or the moments where you had kind of those big learnings?
Well, you probably not enough time to talk about all those. I think as Mario said, it's about batting average.
Yeah.
I would say some of the investments, I did an investment in a physician practice management company in 1992. Mm-hmm. Turns out that was a good idea, but that was probably 20 years ahead of its time.
Yeah.
So it was very hard we were kind of a pioneer, and the pioneer kind of got shot. It was very hard to get physicians together and make them operate as a whole and
right.
turn them into a corporate entity. But then that has now happened with HMOs and
right.
it's blossomed today. But we learned, you want to be cutting edge, but not too cutting edge investments. Right. It's too ahead of your time.
Yeah.
I'd also say, the siren song of leverage is something you need to resist. So
yeah.
there's many times in the banking cycle where we literally could leverage things 10% equity, 90% debt.
Yeah.
And that often limits your financial flexibility. We stayed away from a lot of that, but I think it's at some points I've been on situations where maybe we took advantage a little too much of the debt markets that
right.
hurt our flexibility when we had the downturn, especially in the crash years.
Right, right. But you still weathered the storm, which is the important
part.
Absolutely. So you've talked a lot about why the firm's been successful and some of the strategies. But I think, on a personal level, what do you think led to your success? I mean, you kind of came at this thinking you were going to be a school teacher and then became one of the most successful people in private equity ever. Like, what was really behind that?
Well, I think a couple of things. I had great bosses initially. You have to be fortunate in life to have great bosses at Bain & Company, and they're still 2 of my best friends. Yeah. After many, many years, I still consult them on many things. And so they really taught me the craft. Right. And saw potential in someone who didn't have a lot of business experience at the time. Mm-hmm. I got a business school degree, but not a lot of solid business experience. Yeah. I think secondly, what you probably all learn over life is a lot of this is about showing up and resiliency. There's a great new book out called Grit by Angela Duckworth, yeah. Who says, who's a psychologist down at Penn, and they say how do those people separate to be really successful? What's kind of common among thousands that you've studied? And this thing called grit, which is being able to accept failure, come back and say, reorient the strategies. You've done venture.
Yeah.
You know, most ventures start out on one path, and the ones that are successful have to move to another path.
Every single one of them.
Yeah, they just don't stay on the same path.
None of them start as you think they're going to be.
So I think the second is, and we look for that in our CEOs and entrepreneurs, a lot of grit and flexibility to change the strategy. And then third, I think in general, the best investors stay humble.
Yeah.
So no matter how good we think a deal is, and if you look at train wrecks of private equity firms or hedge funds, the common theme I've seen there is they see a really good idea, like back in the 90s, there were CLEX, telecom businesses were exploding, and a couple of funds took huge positions, and I was reading about it in the journal, said, why aren't we in for $1 billion? Why haven't we done 10 telecom deals?
Yeah.
Well, it's because we have very strict rules saying we got to be diversified no matter how smart we think we are.
Right.
We're just not going to pile into one industry that's hot because something can always go wrong. So I think the third component is kind of being diversified. It's kind of like being balanced in life, being balanced in your investment portfolio, and never thinking you're so smart that you can predict everything that's going to happen out there. So being diversified and conservative is very important.
Yeah, and I think it's probably the most important, but it's so much easier said than done. I mean, when you're off a big string of successes, how do you stay humble, and how do you remember that there might be another one around the corner? I know that I always work hardest as an entrepreneur just after coming out of a failure because you're like, now I got something to prove on this one.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the crisis was horrible for us because we were a victim of bad timing at that point because we had just raised funds in 2004, 5, 6, and they were invested right before that crisis hit. And some of the companies were advertising dependent, and advertising dropped 50% the year after the crisis.
Yeah.
So I think that was a bad experience. The good news is we returned well on that portfolio on a relative basis. Our investors stuck with us. But I think that's affected our entire company in that we really stepped back and said, okay, we've really got to pressure test these downsides. We've really got to really make an effort in these vertical markets to understand it better than anybody else. And we really got to stick to that diversification by time, diversification by industry, diversification by company.
Right, totally. So let's talk about internally both the culture that you have within your own team and then the culture within the companies you invest in. And how do you think that plays a role in some of the success?
Looking back, I think it plays a huge role. And it's really interesting. One of my children, I had interviews when I got that job with Bain & Company, with McKinsey, Bain & Company, and BCG and Booz Allen. And kind of 25 years later, one of my kids had interviews with the same companies coming out of Harvard Business School.
Yeah.
And when I had the interviews, each of those companies, I thought a different thing about them. I thought Bain was a very kind of balanced, people-oriented company with a lot of state-of-the-art ideas. BCG was cutting-edge, kind of hard-driving, scientific type approach. McKinsey was really great at providing options. It was almost like the law firm. They were the brand name, law firm. They were a little more formal in the interviews.
Yeah.
And so it really struck me when one of my children interviewed those places, and I said, "What are your impressions?" And it's now it's like 28 years later, and you think companies would change a bit, and without any prompting, it was basically the same three things.
Really?
BCG was huge into the technical aspects and hard driving. The case interviews were the toughest at BCG. McKinsey was still kind of a great brand name and provided great strategy for companies. And Bain & Company had the same kind of balance. So luckily they chose Bain & Company. I've been going for 30 years, but they chose Bain & Company.
They didn't have anyone encouraging them to go to Bain, I'm sure.
Probably not. But the culture stays with these firms, and what's happened with us is, I think most of our culture came from the early days of Bain & Company, which we've stuck with, which is to be really respectful. The CEOs were our clients.
Yeah.
And so we grew up being very respectful of CEOs and the problems they faced and how to serve them and advise them. And when we went into private equity, we weren't people coming in, lighting up some cigars and saying, do this, do that. We take a very fact-driven approach, which stemmed from our being consultants and being a client service organization. So we work with management teams and supply resources to look at new markets, look at acquisitions, look at how we can invest in new product studies. And we've done some very exciting things. So we've kind of taken that same culture
Yeah.
And in fact, one of the partners, longtime partners who's retired now at Bain & Company, called me up, and he's writing a book, and he said, it's really interesting when he comes to Bain Capital, he's an investor, it reminds him exactly of the early days of Bain. The same culture, the same respect for people, the same fact-based approach.
Yeah.
So if you had to describe Bain Capital, it is a very collegial company. It has respect for people. We try to take care of all of our people. We respect our CEOs. And we do everything based on data, not on politics, meritocracy and data. And those kind of stem from the early days, what I experienced. And most of the partners who have consulting experience at Bain Capital experienced at Bain & Company.
It's pretty remarkable that this has stayed so consistent over the 30 years.
It really is. I learned lessons for investing in businesses because if you look at those firms themselves, and a lot of firms, the firms that are successful actually maximize their kind of key culture and key values, and they keep them for a long period of time. And it's scary, as you know, when you look at the Fortune 50 of only, probably 30 years ago, there's only a couple left.
I know.
In there.
Pace of disruption keeps getting faster.
But the companies that have kind of retained that culture and retained that distinctive advantage, they'll remain the longest period of time. We're hoping that will happen with Bain Capital as well.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. So what do you think are...
I also had what's interesting too is what's very different from when I started. When we started, the business was mainly U.S., New York-driven business. Investing in venture capital, or investing in companies in the U.S. The big change that's happened in private equity is for the firms that have assets under management, the Blackstones, the Bain Capitals, and the KKRs, is globalization.
Right.
And we were a big beneficiary of globalization because the dynamics that allowed us to turn around and grow companies here were even more in demand in Europe, more in demand in Asia. Right. And we could bring that management expertise and that global network to help companies in Asia to export products here, help our companies export there. So that's been the big change, and the successful companies have really taken advantage of using that expertise on a global basis.
Yeah, no, for sure.
I.e., unfortunately, my travel schedule.
You have to be.
See from my last week.
And it's happened everywhere. I'm on the board of Vail Resorts, and it went from a 3-resort company to a 16-resort global company. And one of the primary things you talk about on the board is how do you maintain that culture as you get bigger and bigger, and as you become certainly more global.
Look, we have a very interconnected world today. That globalization has come with a lot of benefits. It's lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. If you look in general, the world's been lifted up. But now, as you know, we're in a period where the industrialized Western economies have experienced a lot of dislocation from globalization and technology impact, and so we're seeing a lot of kind of probably since I've been doing this more political unrest globally than we've seen in a long period of time, maybe since the Cold War.
Right, and so where do you think that's going? Where are we? What era are we headed into? If that's kind of we're headed into an era of unrest. We have lots of people trying to sway opinions on Facebook News now. There's a lot that's going into, and what does that look like, and how do you think about that political global risk as you invest?
Well, we are primarily microeconomists who look at the businesses themselves. How can we change that and grow it and make it a better company? But clearly, we've been putting macro overlays on that. We try to price that risk in.
Right.
I'm hopeful, if you look over the history of time, and my mother was a history teacher, all these economies, lurch in different directions, and you have different cycles. And so the globalization has brought us a lot of polarization in the United States and many countries in Europe. Brexit is another example of something that's happened because of the polarization that's happened and people feeling they don't have the opportunities they used to have in their countries themselves. But what's happened in most countries, what has happened in America historically, and there's always this has been going on since Andrew Jackson, William Jennings Bryan burned business people on a cross of gold. We've rebounded from that because the fundamental principles have stayed intact. That's a meritocracy. We've moved to more civil rights. The North America, Canada, and the U.S. probably have more resources in terms of oil and gas than any other countries in the world. Resources in terms of education, resources in terms of food and agriculture. So we're very lucky here to be in North America with the democratic systems we have. And the great thing in the United States is it is a big system of checks and balances. So you can only lurch so far in one direction. And as you've seen,
we're seeing it on both ends of this election.
Yes, there's governors on those aspects. So what I'm hopeful is that what's always happened in the past, you step back and people have recognized there's dislocation with technology. People have recognized the dislocation with globalization. And so we need to come together and develop programs to create those jobs, to make sure everybody does have an opportunity, and that's in the discourse today. And I think hopefully the parties will realize it's fruitless to just try to get elected on divisive platforms on both sides. And we'll pull together with Canada and other countries to say, okay, let's take globalization and make it work for everybody.
Right.
And we have the resources to do that. Look, the interesting thing is the markets are at an all-time high. We seem to chug through all these dislocations, including nuclear weapons in Korea and civil wars and Russian interference with elections, et cetera, et cetera. And why is that? It's because the base of the population is free, there's private enterprise, and they're still driving the economy in spite of some of this political up and down, and normally you see a moderation, and hopefully this will be a catalyst for moderation.
I think so too. So back to the opportunities you see right now in the private equity world. What are you kind of most excited about, and what do you think are kind of the riskiest areas as you look at, the next 5 years, let's say?
Well, I think I have to divide it into two categories. One would be what are the opportunities globally, in general, and then what are opportunities in certain industries. So obviously something you're experienced with in finance, we've done a lot in financial services and technology. So we've made great investment in Blue Coat Software, which is now Symantec. Software security, cybersecurity, we're looking at lots of interesting opportunities there. We're looking at interesting opportunities in Japan. As we speak, we've just signed a deal to buy Toshiba Memory Corporation, which is divestiture by Toshiba, a fine company that has one of the leading market shares in the latest and greatest advanced SSD chips. And so technology is a very interesting area. And again, with the markets at an all-time high, the only way we can invest is if we look at these archetypes and say, okay, can we acquire a company? How can we build a company and make it different? Because you're not going to have automatic multiple expansion. In fact, some of our deals we're saying we're going to have multiple contraction. So the only way to make a great return for investors is to make sure that we increase the earnings and increase the strategic position of the company so that we can withstand multiple staying the same or contraction. Now, a lot of times when you make a company stronger and better market share, even if multiples have fallen for the industry group, your multiple will stay higher because you're a leading company. So that's the defense in markets like this. So this is a very difficult market. We're being very selective. Toshiba is an example of kind of a global big deal that involved all of our offices, is everywhere, and involved bringing in strategic partners, having Apple and other companies invest in the deal to make it work. So those kind of complex situations, large private equity firms can handle and I think make money on.
Have the expertise to do so. So that's kind of the exciting part, technology, fintech, some of these other, global deals.
Healthcare is changing. We've done, Bain Capital's done a lot in healthcare. I helped start the healthcare group there. We had acquired HCA, the largest hospital company in America, for I think $33 billion in 2007. We raised $27 million debt on that one. That's when we had a fair amount of debt. But that's worth $70, $80 billion today because our thesis was that it was a leading company. People were going to need healthcare. It had great demographics. It was in the best areas. It had high market share, delivered great quality service, and that thesis played out. So I think a strong thesis on some kind of growth in today's markets. If you step back, interest rates are as low as they've ever been, obviously.
For an extended period of time. And
the question is, when and how is that going to change? As we try to, slowly back off of the quantitative easing that's happening on a global basis. Now, the good news is when you step back, if you look at the deficits in most of the governments across the world, including Japan and the United States, it's going to be hard to raise interest rates a lot with the national debt levels. Where they are.
Country they're going to keep up.
I think we may be looking at a benign interest rate environment for a whole host of reasons. But if that changes, you have to have companies that have the earnings and are not too levered to withstand that kind of pressure.
Right. So then do you see any areas of the market that you think are just too risky now going into the next 5 years that don't, given that we're at the top of the market, or industries you're a little more scared of?
We don't look at it that way because every deal stands on its own. So some industries you can pay 13 times earnings if they're growing at 30% per year.
Right.
And other ones you shouldn't if you don't think you're going to make the growth plan. So we try to do a very detailed analysis of saying how much conviction do we have that this can make the growth plan and be worth that multiple that we're paying, and how much conviction do we have that we'll still have growth left. So when we exit or take it public or sell it to another company, that company's still a great company and grow for the next 5 years.
Yeah. So let's switch gears to basketball. So you're one of the owner of the Boston Celtics. How's that experience been? What have you learned from that? Was that totally different than some of the other deals you had done? It's certainly not the Staples deal.
Yeah, it's definitely different. I've always been a huge basketball fan. I played at Duke a little bit. I've had 3 sons play college basketball, 2 of them played at Duke, and 1 at Amherst, and so we've been a great basketball family. And with the opportunity to partner with Wick Grossbeck, who brought the opportunity to buy the Celtics, was there. We didn't really do it as an economic investment. We did it as an investment to say, we wanted to bring championships back to Boston.
Right.
So they had 1 in 16 years. The performance on the court wasn't great. The performance economic wasn't great. So we tried to construct a deal with very low leverage that we felt like the main pitch to investors was we want to bring a championship back to Boston. And we're calling this, we called the company Banner 17.
Right.
Which was an audacious term because we'd won 16 banners. Yeah. And we explicitly said in the pitch to people who would partner with us, it's not IRR 17, it's Banner 17, and we're going to try not to have capital calls. What turns out is that we applied some of the techniques. Wick was in venture capital as well, and we went in and looked at a blueprint, and we said, gee, we need to get better players, we need to get better training, we need to be more fan friendly. We had a strategic plan just like we would for any business.
Yeah.
The main difference in sports and buying something like HCA is that in sports the scrutiny is endless.
Endless. Certainly.
So
there's a million stats on every part of your scrutiny.
You have a strategic plan. Our plan was to bring in the best coaching players and talent and do that over a period of time to make the stadium much more fan-friendly and get connected with our customers, and then finally to do a big community impact. So we started the Boston Celtics Shamrock Foundation. That was the 3 pillars of our plan. What many owners find is when you get into it, it's hard to execute that plan when you're driving down to work and they say, the Celtics are terrible, Steve Pagliuca's calling the plays, he doesn't know what he's doing, you're hearing this and it's on a daily basis. They got to fire the coach, they should fire themselves. It's kind of depressing as you're going in the right direction, but I think the principles we had from Wick's old firm and Bain Capital were that we were going to find A players, stick with A players, as long as they were executing on the plan, we wouldn't change them. And what happens with many situations is with new owners come in and they hear all the talk radio things, and so they go out and they trade for an aging star. So the ticket sales go up a little bit, but you can't win in the NBA with aging stars because they age and they're not stars anymore. So
it's funny how this is a graph that always goes one direction.
Yes, it's one directional graph, and you, except for investing, the older you get, the better you get investing. Yeah. So, you'll have a great next 40 years. So we stuck to that plan, and I remember having one meeting where the papers were saying we should fire Doc Rivers, who turned out to be a championship coach and is one of the best coaches around. We should fire Danny Ainge, who turns out to be one of the best general managers. And we said, look, we like what they're doing. The players are getting better. The picks we've had are good. They're young. They're losing because we've had injuries. They're losing because they're young. And it's going to happen. And then we'll take this young talent, we can trade for some other talent, and we made the big trade. And we won a championship a year after we lost 50 games. And then we went to the finals the next year. And now we're doing it really a second time again. So I think what you learn from the business world is you've got to get the right people, back and stick with those people in good times and bad times. It's always easy to say things are great when things are going well. The test of a Bain Capital is when things are not going well. You look inward, you don't look outward. You take blame, you don't give blame, and that's the same thing we've done to the Celtics, and it's been very effective.
And it still must have been different because there was a different level of public scrutiny on your name's being thrown around on talk radio. It's like there was certainly lots of still has a scrutiny on deals, but it must have been different, and that must have led to kind of a new learning or a different kind of thicker skin after
Yeah,
all of
you
it.
definitely learn things like don't eat nachos when you're sitting in the court in the front row, because then you get 1,000 emails, you're spilling nachos. And what are you doing? You don't
Word of the wise, if any of you want to buy a basketball team.
You don't even think about that.
Yeah.
You don't think about any of those kinds of things. And
Right.
the second thing was interesting is I had worked on $30 billion deals, $10 billion, $5 billion deals.
Yeah.
And we had press conferences on those deals, and there'd be 2 or 3 people from news organizations showing up.
Wall Street Journal shows up.
And I had no idea. The Celtics is actually, compared to these businesses, a very small business at the time.
Right.
Less than 100 million in revenues.
Yeah.
And we had kind of bought it secretly, and we announced, we said we're going to have a press conference. The ownership was going to have a press conference to say it was shifting over to our ownership group. And I thought, okay, we'll go to the press conference, there'll be 4 or 5 people. There were like hundreds of people, hundreds of media there, and lights going off, and it was stunning. It was absolutely stunning. I was looking around.
Got your celebrity experience.
Is this really happening all in one day? And we were driving over. To go to the press conference, and the talk radio was on, and the Celtics were a limited partnership structure, a very complicated structure. And Wick and I were in the car, and the radio said, "These guys are incredible. They paid $720 million for the Celtics." Now, I thought we had paid $360, which shows you about talk radio too. They're not the greatest business people. So they had kind of thought we had bought control in half the company or something. I said, "Wait. I didn't miss something. We didn't pay $720 for this thing, did we?" But we actually did pay $360, thank God, when I checked again, and Talk Radio had done the calculations wrong.
So really, you can never trust anything you hear on talk radio or anything you read on the internet.
Well, I don't know if I go that far, but certainly news has changed in the last 10 years or so, for sure. I mean,
Yeah.
it's definitely
I think
an
that's
issue.
the understatement.
It even affects the deal market. I mean,
Yeah.
it's definitely an issue in sports and in the deal market. I mean, I get calls from people saying, "Gee, I hear you're trading your top 3 players for this guy or whatever," and I'm like, "It sounds so credible."
Right.
And then I call our general manager and I said, "They say this is going to happen like tomorrow. We just met yesterday. We hadn't heard about it."
Yeah.
And he's like, "We never even talked about it."
Yeah.
So there are whole trades done and things done, and it's the same thing in business now. You hear this company's buying that company, and it turns out it's not true because there's less of a filter now on the news with Twitter and everybody having access to their own news. So,
Yeah.
we're in a brave new world now. I think it'll get sorted out.
Yeah.
I have ultimate faith in the Canadian and American public that they're smart people,
Right.
and they're stepping back and they're assessing, where their sources are. And shame on us if we can't differentiate that. It's really up to us to try to get a fact base and try to sort out, what's real and what's not real.
Yeah.
But it's certainly more confusing than it used to be.
Totally, and I think everyone is struggling from this, from governments to Mark Zuckerberg to everyone. It's how do we now live in a world where we can't compensate journalists the same way, and you can now post anything you want, and how do we get good information?
Look, and you've always had to have you all have had to, and us have thick skin to be in business, and I think you have to have thicker skin now. I'm working on that. I'm eating a lot. I'm trying to get my skin thicker.
the game. So we have a lot of family offices in the room, and so if there's one piece of advice that you could give to those that are trying to steward their capital, what would that be?
I think a little bit like the mantra we have at Bain, when I think about it, Bain Capital is there's no get rich quick scheme. The great family offices have done it over a long period of time, and to use a football analogy, an American football analogy, we call 3 yards in a cloud of dust. So keep running the ball a little bit, one by one. Make prudent investments, and then there's a great thing called compounding. If you make prudent investments and you lose less than other people, you'll find that your family office can kind of double every 6 or 7 years if you take that strategy.
Right.
The people I've seen that have made mistakes is, again, in family offices and in funds, they pile into one area. They say the internet's great. And the internet is great, but if you're paying 75 times earnings for a company, it has to be really great.
It's hard to be really great for a long time.
So when people say, "Gee, you ought to buy more internet stuff because it's a hot area," well, there's pricing involved in a hot area.
Yeah.
So you might make more money buying an industrial company that makes tires because you're buying that at a multiple that's much less than you'd have to pay for the growth you get for an internet company. So I would say in general, be diversified, be patient, just like with the Celtics, be patient and try to make the money over a long period of time. make long-term investments, so you're not flipping things around. You end up paying transaction fees, and the data shows you kind of get out early in the ones that are successful because you book a profit, and the ones that aren't successful, you're taking a lot of losses on as you ride them down.
Right.
So have a thesis, stick to that thesis, stay diversified, and take a long-term approach.
Right. And so how do you think about, I know that you've done a lot of philanthropy in your life, been very successful, gotten awards from President Clinton. How do you think about the philanthropy part of giving back?
That's a great question. We're studying that as we speak, and my wife is very active in philanthropy, and we're trying to figure out how to do that. And there are great organizations that are popping up, like New Profit, where people are taking a much more fact-based, we do that at the Celtics, our Shamrock Foundation. We try to get fact-based on, is the money getting to people, and is it affecting the behavior that you want to get affected? So it's almost taking a kind of analytic business approach to say, what's the outcome? Rather than just spreading money to all sorts of organizations.
Yeah.
What are you trying to accomplish with your philanthropy? And we're focused on things like we basically built the Harvard Life Lab. It's called the Pagliuca Life Lab, which basically is a facility, a wet lab, that any student affiliated with Harvard can come in and start up a business.
Right.
And they get preferential rates. It's in biotechnology. And it's very hard to start businesses in biotechnology because there's a huge shortage of space.
When you can't really do it in your garage.
And you can't do it in your garage. It's very specialized equipment. So the dean of the business school came to us, and my daughter-in-law is in biotech, and we invest in biotech at Bank Capital, we have a biotech fund, and I've been looking at biotech for many, many years, and said, we should combine, maybe you could put up a building that offers this facility. And it was risky because who knows, would they come up with business? But it got through in record time. The dean and Drew Faust and the mayor pushed it through, and it opened up about a year ago, last November 8th, I think.
Yeah.
And it already has 17 businesses in it, and 7 have got funding from private equity. So it's creating helping that ecosystem in Boston, keeping our people in the area. So I would say from a practice standpoint, that's been very effective in accomplishing the goals that we want to accomplish, and I've seen other people do that. So target your goals and then have measurements. And we were hoping to get 15 companies in there. We have 17, so far that's on track.
So I'm sensing this original Bain thesis has kind of translated throughout, the deals, the basketball team, the philanthropic giving.
I think it's a unified field theory. I guess I'm a product of the luck of joining, Bain and having great bosses, and Bill Bain's original strategy with the company, and it served me well.
Got it. So just as we wrap up here, really open-ended question: what's the best piece of advice you've ever received?
That's interesting. I would say my boss Harry Strachan said that we're all very driven, and when I came into Bain, I wanted to make an impact, and it was kind of point A to point B. What's the straightest distance? Go in a line and just get it done.
Yeah.
And he said, look, you're doing a great job, but what you have to realize is in everything you do, all the world's a stage. The Shakespeare, all the world's a stage.
You're just the players.
And what that meant was it's really critical to bring along the team members who weren't doing as well just as much as it was to invest in the stars.
Right.
Respecting the administrative staff, because you couldn't be there without it. The same thing at the Celtics, where the trainer, the people that make our players be able to play, they're an integral part of the team. And so I've given that advice now. I credit him for the advice to me, but I've probably given that advice to over 200 people at Bain Capital now, because when you're young and you're trying to accomplish things, you can kind of forget about the bigger picture at times, that it's a team environment. You win as a team, you don't win as an individual.
Yeah.
And all the world is a stage, and people actually, it's not what you say, it's what you do. And even today, when I go visit a company and I see a CEO screaming at his assistant or blaming somebody else in the company for some problem, even though he's the CEO of the company, that's probably someone we don't want to back. We want to back people that take responsibility, have accountability, and say, look, I made this mistake, here's how we're going to correct it this time, and here's the team that's going to do it, and that's how we're going to operate. So I think the best advice is, it's a long way of saying that all the world's a stage really encompasses that, because people are watching what you're doing, they're watching for leadership, they're watching, are you doing the right thing, and are you treating people the right way, and when you do that, that tends to breed success.
It's amazing. Well, thank you. I think that's amazing parting words to leave the audience. Thank you so much.
I throw in one more concept in my last.
Get a second piece of advice.
Doc Rivers, to pull the Celtics in, Doc Rivers brought the concept of Ubuntu
Yep.
in our championship year at the Celtics, and that's an African word meaning, which was really fascinating, and the team really rallied around it. We still have that culture today at the Celtics and at Bain Capital, where Ubuntu is an African concept that says you're only who you are because of someone else who's helped you.
Right.
And so, no one is born a great investor, and no one is born a great leader.
Right.
You are a product of your whole environment.
Yeah.
And so remembering that and pulling together and paying it back to other people coming up, will make it better for all of us in Canada, the United States, and the whole world.
Right. It's a great parting thought to leave with.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you.
Thank you.